Welcome, listeners. This episode, I'm going to discuss the world of adventure elopement photography and the explosion that this specific industry has seen post-pandemic or really since 2020. A lot of couples did a few things when it came to weddings after the pandemic. We saw more intimate weddings on the rise, more people opting out of the big parties, and more couples wanting to spend less on big celebrations and more on intimate and memorable moments with their significant others. And although this has sparked a true boost in the adventurous photography world, with it has come some challenges, including showing up in a national park to photograph your client's elopements, only to find 20 plus other people there to celebrate, to which the couple did not inform you about. And now you are violating permits that have been in place. Constant changes in travel plans with your couples due to the pandemic and wildfires and other natural disasters shutting down your planned locations that you were going to shoot at and have the ceremonies at, and then increased planning responsibilities all around for adventure photographers. So in order to chat through all this with you, I knew I needed to bring on an experienced adventure elopement photographer here on the podcast as a guest to help me out. And I am excited to have Nina Larsen Reed joining us today. Nina is a Colorado-based elopement photographer and hiker chick. She grew up on a tiny island in Norway and then moved to Boulder, Colorado in 2010, fell in love with the sunny Rocky Mountains and her now husband, and has never looked back. Nina is now a mom to a baby girl, and she specializes in tiny elopements close to home. So without further ado, you guys, let's get into this topic, Legal Pagers. You're listening to the Legal Paige podcast, where we chat about life and business with a legal twist. I'm Paige, attorney and photographer helping online businesses and creatives tackle their business dreams without breaking out in hives. No more legal mumbo jumbo. This podcast features simple, bite-sized advice that'll have you legally legit in no time. Are you ready? Let's get started. Hey friends, thanks again for listening to today's podcast. Nina is here with me to talk about kind of the post-pandemic big explosion of adventure elopement photography and how to best protect your business moving forward if you are an adventurous photographer. So Nina, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Nina, I would love for you to give our listeners a little insight into who you are and your background.
Yeah. So, as you already mentioned, I'm a elopement photographer here in Colorado, but I didn't start out that way. I actually started out as a studio photographer who was mostly shooting like dance and yoga and all of those type of things, which is really fun in a place like Boulder where everyone does something fitness related. But I got very tired of being inside a dark studio all the time and really wanted to get out into the mountains more. And so when I realized that you could go get married outside in the mountains without having to have all this fuss about it, that was such an eye-opener for me. And really when I decided to get into weddings and elopements instead. And then I used to do a little bit of both, but I had really been waiting for an excuse to get into just elopements. And then March 2020 happened, and that was the big glaring sign I had been waiting for. So yeah, literally the week of the shutdown was when I took all the big wedding stuff off my website and just decided to go all in on elopements.
Oh, that's funny. It's perfect timing for this podcast episode too, because you are teed up with, doing adventure photography basically right when the pandemic hit. So in pandemic, and we call it post-pandemic now, just because I feel like I like to, qualify 2020 as the big pandemic year. And then last year was like a lot of us in the elopement and wedding and event industry, like crawling out of whatever we experienced in 2020, which was hard and different for everyone. And then now that we've, gotten through 2021 and basically all of our reschedules, you and I are both seeing a huge trend for people moving from larger, more traditional style of weddings with wedding parties and families and large venues, dancing, all of the things, sit down meals, you can think of that, to either more intimate style weddings with fewer people, just due to we still live in, a pandemic world. And so it's easier to really work with less people, less guests at a wedding. And then also people just moving straight into kind of adventure elopements where it's just them and their significant other, having the ceremony. So, with that being said, I would love for you to kind of describe in your own words what adventure elopement photography actually is to you and to all of, your community members that you see that are adventure photographers.
Yeah, so I personally don't actually think of myself as an adventure elopement photographer, just because the word adventure can have so many connotations for people that isn't necessarily as inclusive and welcoming as I want it to be. Because I think, especially living in a place like Colorado where we have all of these mountains and, we're always posting photos of our couples with backpacks on and stuff like that. I think that can be really intimidating for a lot of couples. And so, I try to explain to people that you can still have an intimate elopement day out in nature without having to be, these super fit hikers who want to be at the top of the mountain. And so for me, elopement photography is much more about planning a day that is all about you and your relationship and not about everyone else's expectations of what your wedding day should look like. And so on my end as the photographer, that comes with doing a lot of planning for my couples, with finding the right locations, helping them navigate any permits they need, the best time of day, best lighting, best locations, best time of year, even because a lot of people won't even have their wedding date picked out before booking me and just know they want wildflowers or fall colors or, all of those things. And so it's really so much more involved than just wedding photography where you just get to, know okay, I'm showing up at this time, I'm taking photos, I'm leaving, and that's my job. So yeah, there's just a whole lot more planning involved with elopements than traditional weddings.
Yeah, you're definitely more of a quasi-planner, I would say. You are one of the only ones that's really a vendor to the overall elopement experience for your couples. I love that you said the word adventure is pretty subjective and it has, different connotations that could be intimidating to people. It could just be outdoor elopement photography, but it's really interesting because I'm sure you've seen in groups now too, the word elopement oftentimes has a bad connotation too, where mothers of one of the spouses could be like, you're eloping without me? Like, WTF, what does that even mean? That's not fair. So I know people have used the term, intimate weddings or micro weddings. I don't know if you've heard any others, but we call it adventure elopement photography just because that's our contract templates that we have. And it's like the easiest way to describe it. But yeah, there's all kinds of different ways that photographers qualify the photography that they do. I don't know if you have any more say on that or have heard from people like what they put on their websites.
Not really, because I think part of what's fun about this is that we all get to decide exactly what we want to do. Like, I have a friend who only shoots stuff with less than 5 people total. So she would, prefer to not even have any guests there. I have friends who love the stuff where it's like 15 to 20, 30 guests, where there's still some of that candid interaction happening with people. And they hate the ones where it's just the couple because it feels like there's nothing happening without you telling them what to do all day. So I just think it's so much more freeing for both the photographer and the couple when you're not stuck in this box of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I think the main thing is people are really looking for a unique wedding experience that is a little bit more intimate than a huge 200, 300 person, event. It's like a whole event throughout the day. And something that's more memorable for them too, where they can really experience every single moment and minute versus it just kind of flying by on the wedding day. I used to shoot traditional weddings. I've shot 100 or more of them in my time as a wedding photographer. And that's just, that was the niche that I was in. And now that my eyes are really open to kind of this adventurous, elopement, intimate wedding world, it's really cool to see what people are doing. And like you said, they don't have to go backpacking for 5 to 10 miles in, stay the night, get up at, right before sunrise to hit the peak of the mountain to take those photos. You can just go, down a trail to find a really good location that's for like beginner hikers or people that wouldn't even qualify themselves as hikers. So that's cool that you offer that as well. Now, let's go to 2020. Can you kind of talk about and this is so interesting from your perspective too, because you were just getting started, March 2020. What was it, of elopement photography looking like on the adventure side of things in 2020? And now how have you seen it expand in 2021 and now moving into 2022?
Yeah. So, I mean, I did a lot of elopements before the pandemic started too. But, at the time it was still this thing where there wasn't all day elopements. They weren't as activity based. It was more of like, we want a simple ceremony outside and some cool photos in a cool location, 2 to 3 hours max. And I don't know if this was a Colorado thing, but it seemed like everyone had a 3-hour elopement package for $1,500. And that was the go-to, because everyone treated it as like, it was so much cheaper than a traditional wedding because, it's just a few hours of photos. And so, I wasn't doing nearly as much planning for my couples then as I was now. It was more of that they already had a location picked up. I would show up and take the photos, and it felt more like being just the photographer. With the pandemic, you had a lot of couples who had to drastically change their plans based on what they thought their wedding day was supposed to be like. And while some people chose to postpone their big weddings and, just hope they would be able to do them later, I think a lot of people were like, you know what, this is the sign we have been waiting for, that we don't have to do this whole production in order to say that we're married to each other. And so I definitely got a lot of people reaching out to me, like once the initial shutdown was done and, we were allowed to leave our houses again and all of that, people who started planning their elopements based on, we don't want to wait to start our married lives together. We want to do something now. And if that means we can't have friends and family along, we're totally okay with that trade-off because we would rather get married than to wait for a big party. And then my favorite is the amount of couples who told me that, we actually want to hurry up and get married now during the pandemic, so we have an excuse to not invite anyone because that sounds so much more fun to us. Like, I just love that.
Yeah, I saw that all the time too. People were like, okay, well, we're just going to get married and then, not spend $100,000 on the massive event. We're just going to spend all of our money on a really, amazing adventure elopement photographer. And you guys kind of do everything for them and really make it such a special day. Like you said, I think it used to be 2 to 3 hours was common. And now they're like, we get 8 to 10 hours just between the two of us. Yep. And it's going to be so much more it's the moments, it really is going to capture the essence of you two as a couple a lot more. And it's just going to be a ton more memorable that way. So yeah, I saw a lot of people being like, screw the big weddings and we can put that on like a down payment on a house. Funny like sidetrack here. I was working with a jeweler at the time. So many people know this from my previous podcast episodes, but I had planned a big wedding in 2019 with my husband now. And that got postponed to end of 2020. And it was in Hawaii. And it was a big wedding with everybody. And it never happened because of the pandemic. And so when I was like talking to my jeweler and I was like, whatever, I'm still just going to get a wedding band and like, we're going to go get married at the courthouse. And that's what we did. But she was saying more people in 2020 ended up using their wedding budget on photography. Like they would just put all of their money into photography or a down payment on a house or a ring. Like they would increase their ring size. And I was like, that's so, I didn't think about it. I was like, maybe, they had a tough year. And she was like, no, it was the best year we've ever had. And that totally made sense. And same with like real estate agents. They're like all these new homeowners, newly married couples are looking for houses. And if they didn't have the big wedding, they could put that money towards that. So super interesting that you said that. And then also, I'm thinking too, in terms of that makes total sense for 2020, right? People were just jumping on the elopement board train. But what have you seen in terms of, more people are wanting elopements, right? So where there is demand, like there needs to be supply. And I think a lot of
plenty supply.
Plenty of supply now. But I think I've just seen this like massive trajectory and exponential increase in elopement photographers across the board. Like I know you've seen it in Colorado, but I've seen it. People have like pivoted their entire businesses here in Montana as photographers to just do kind of more elopement style weddings. So what have you seen with that trend with more and more photographers getting into it?
Well, I think when the shutdown first happened, like there was this split where a lot of people were like, it's going to be back open again before wedding season. I'll just hold tight. Like everything will be fine. I don't have to change anything. But then I think there were a lot of people who were in my boat too, where they had been looking for an excuse to change things and, took the more conservative approach of, I don't actually know when we'll be able to have big weddings again. And even if we get them, do I actually want to be doing that? And then, I feel like it would be remiss to not mention like Maddie's elopement photographer course coming out right around that time too was such excellent timing for all of us because, I'd been shooting elopements for a couple of years before that, but the amount of people who finally had this blueprint in front of them that they could just follow of like, oh, this is what I need to do. Like, here's how I plan for people and what I need to be doing in addition to taking good photos, I think really helped with that growth a lot too, because there was nothing like it on the market beforehand. If starting with elopements and weddings in 2017, like I just had to figure everything out on my own and there was no one really teaching you how to do that. And going through getting those first Craigslist bookings and everything else, because that was where people who were eloping were looking for photographers at the time to, now they're actually being this industry, but also the community of people helping each other along and sharing what they know about it. I think that timing was so good for so many people who wanted to get into the market.
Yeah, I'm really glad you made a plug for a course that we both truly love and appreciate, and an educator that we, both just have such good feelings towards. So Maddie Mae of Adventure Instead, you guys, is the person that Nina just mentioned, and she runs the Adventure Instead Academy. And I do remember, I think she launched her course like at the beginning of March, if I recall, 2020, or the end of February. I can't totally remember. And then, of course, the shutdown happened like right around March 16th or 17th. So it was perfect timing. And obviously, she had no idea that's what was going to occur. Nobody did.
Nope.
But it really helped people like jump into the course right at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen, quite an increase in people in her groups as well that have joined the course that are now wanting to specialize in adventure elopement photography. The other thing that I was thinking when you were talking is, I think a lot of couples probably have this conversation when they first get engaged. I remember being like, oh, I can't wait to plan my wedding. But then I think about it and I'm like, that's a lot of money and time and energy and like stress. Why don't we just go on a month-long vacation?
Exactly.
I think everyone has that conversation and they have that like moment in where they're like, wait a second, is this the right choice for us? And would this make the most sense? And is this the best bang for our buck with the funds that we have? And like you said, people were like, oh, perfect. This is our out. We can actually do what we wanted to do. And you can have this like amazing adventurous elopement in the mountains with a photographer, and it's just you and your spouse. And then you can go on that trip and spend a little bit extra money on, a honeymoon down the road, and way less complicated to deal with that during a pandemic than 100 plus guests. So I was thinking about that as well. What are some major things that you have seen adventure photographers facing now when it comes to like intimate weddings with their couples, where it's not, I think it's so much easier, right? If it's just the two people.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So just the two spouses. But if it's more guests involved, I'm sure there's things that you as a photographer are like checking the boxes on to make sure that you can, 1, adequately serve them, 2, the location suffices for them, and 3, that you're actually okay with doing that type of intimate elopement. So can you talk about those?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there is educating couples on what's realistic and actually possible and legal, because a lot of people assume that, we only have 10 guests, we only have 20 guests, we can just go anywhere out in nature, right? Like if it's free for me to visit it and hike, why should it not be free for me to get married there too? And that's really where we as photographers have so much responsibility in making sure that they know that that's not always the case. So, living here in Colorado, Rocky Mountain National Park is one of the places where I shoot the most often. And they have such strict rules on where you can get married, the type of permit you need to have, how many people you can have at a location, what you can bring with you, all of these things. And as you would expect from a government agency, it's really hard to find that information on their websites. Like it's not, easy in the way we have gotten used to in the 2020s of, you want information right in front of you and just to know of, oh, this is what I can do or not. And half the time it's buried in some form written in legalese. And, very difficult to understand, especially if you're just someone who wants to get married on your favorite hiking trail or a place you've never even visited before. And so I think that's been the biggest one, is trying to educate people on what locations are legal, how many people can you have there, do you need a special use permit, what rules do you need to follow, and everything else that comes along with that. And that's not always an easy process, even being the local photographer who's on the ground out here all the time, because rules change so quickly, year to year. Like, again, Rocky Mountain is an example. There hasn't been a year since I started in 2017 where they haven't updated their rules on weddings. And so, yeah, I think for a lot of photographers that are, especially newer getting into this, they think that, oh, I just have to suggest a pretty place and go take awesome photos of the couple out there. But then you start looking into everything else around it, and it's way more work than that.
Yeah. And that's the service that you're providing, which obviously incurs additional costs, like significant additional costs that, of course, you have to explain to your clients. But the main thing that I have seen is the permitting issue. And Nina and I were actually just talking about this before we actually press record on this podcast episode. And it's one of those things that I feel like adventure elopement photographers are all in together on this battle. They want to help one another navigate the permit system because, as Nina said, it literally changes every year. These are bureaucratic government agencies, Bureau of Land Management Services, and national parks do it differently across the board. So there's not just one federal law that applies to all. There is, I can tell you that. I've had YouTube videos on it and I've talked about it in another podcast episode. But that law is interpreted differently by the national parks. And so their agencies, and it's just this trickle down of how each park wants to utilize their own permitting process. What are the differences with special use permits for larger groups? Or can you just, can you go to a normal, public accessible trail and, just take photos there without a permit? It's seriously so different. And I know this is a big issue here in Montana for people in Glacier National Park. It's very different than in Rocky. So that's a big issue. And then, like you said, it's the going down a rabbit hole trying to research permits where you're on these government websites that are already archaic. And then you're trying to figure out what this law actually means. And then sometimes they'll change and they'll be like, well, we're updating our laws or permit processes for this year or regulations, come back soon. But then you're trying to plan for somebody's elopement in 6 months, and you want to make sure you have the proper permitting in place before you move forward with that location. And my whole point here is, if you are an elopement photographer and you're having all these questions that Nina and I just discussed, jump in some really awesome Facebook groups, because you can ask questions and there's probably a photographer or 5 or 10 that literally just went through the same permitting issue, and they can give you suggestions on what to do. However, Nina, I know you have said that you have to be careful in Facebook groups. So I would love for you to touch on that, because I know there's such a great community and people want to share their suggestions and advice, but where do you see that really, butting heads with the actual answer?
Well, I think the main thing to watch out for is if you go into a Facebook group and you search, old posts using the location name, or if I was coming up to Montana and I was searching for Glacier and I find a post that was made a year or two ago, don't trust that information is up to date. That could have changed. So unless it's something posted within the last month or two, or ideally at least in the same calendar year, I would not trust it to be accurate anymore. So try to tag the person who made the post or who left the most helpful comment or anything like that, and see if they have anything updated to offer on that. But I think the best way to use Facebook groups to actually get good advice on things like this is to ask people to point you in the right direction for where you can verify information for yourself. So instead of asking, do I need a permit to shoot at Great Sand Dunes National Park? Ask, where can I find information about this? And if someone can drop you a link or an email to the right person at that agency or whatever else you need to contact them, verify everything for yourself. Because if you go to a location where you weren't legally allowed to shoot and you show up with someone's wedding and a park ranger stops you in the middle of the ceremony and interrupts everything because you didn't have your shit together. Like, sorry, but that is the most embarrassing thing you could experience as an elopement photographer. Like, your couple trusts you to make these decisions and to know better than they do. And so, yeah, just as much as you want to trust other people online, like, you have to verify for yourself as much as possible.
Yeah, I'm glad you said an email from a contact person or an agent in the park or a park ranger. So oftentimes there are like specific permit officials in different parks, and they always change though. So last year's permit official is probably not going to be this year's permit official. We found that out here in Glacier and Yellowstone. So make sure that that's a great suggestion in terms of how to utilize a Facebook group post really well on a permitting issue is to ask if anyone has the contact information or the email for the person who handles permits in X park location. That way, and I always tell people, you've done all of your due diligence. You've researched the issue on the links that they've given you. You've gone down the rabbit hole as far as you can, but you are literally, I want you to get documentation from this park official. And if you can do it in an email, that's even better than on the phone, because you don't actually have proof of what they said was the right thing to do for your specific situation. And if you get that in an email format, then you can bring that with you. Say you didn't have to get a permit for some reason, then you could have that email printed off with you if a park ranger were to stop you, and you could be like, no, I made sure that this was kosher and this is what I was supposed to do. Or yes, they told me to get a permit. Here's the permit that I have. Boom, it's done. You look so professional to your clients and you're ready to go.
Well, and a lot of the time it's hard to find these emails too, because as you say, the staffing often changes very often. But if all you can find is, the phone number for the local ranger district or anything like that, call them. Probably have to leave a voicemail. But whatever answer you get, ask them if they can send it to you in an email so you have it in writing. Because again, like, it is the only proof you have to verify that you have done your due diligence.
Yeah, I love that. Also, such a good follow-up to what I just said. So besides permitting, which is this beast in and of itself and is constantly changing, Nina and I were joking, you guys, before we jumped on too, that everyone tries to set up like a permit database where everyone can go and just get the most up-to-date information about permits in X location for X reason. And there's just no way to do it properly. There's too much risk and liability to make such a database because it's so ever-changing. Like, what happened last week could be different this week. So we don't know of anything out there that we could point you to, is what we're trying to say here. We've both looked, but these are our best approaches to get the permitting thing figured out for your couples. Now, legally speaking, what are other clauses that you have in your current contract that you truly believe really all kind of adventurous elopement photographers need to have? I'd love for you to walk through those.
Yeah, so I think one of the big ones is kind of related to permit, and that's the fact that picking out your location is a shared responsibility. And so usually, I won't have a specific location at the time the couple is booking. So, event location is listed as TBD. Like, we know we have to agree on that. And so my contract outlines that I will provide them with suggested locations, but it is still their responsibility to choose the place they want to go. And I think that's really important because you don't want to have someone come to you on their wedding day and be like, oh man, this place looks nothing like I thought it would from the photos online and I hate it and it's your fault and you need to give me my money back, like worst case scenario. And so making sure that people understand that as much as I research for them and as much as I provide suggestions, they still have to take responsibility for picking out the place they're going to get married. And with that also comes, who is responsible for like park entrance fees or parking fees, making timed entry reservations, securing permits, having those printed out and with you on the wedding day, and everything else related to that. Because that is such a big responsibility compared to when you just show up at a wedding venue and you're doing your job and they've already paid for the venue.
Right. My follow-up question to that is, in your contract, do you have like a regional kind of circumference that you will scout for locations in? So you said, of course, the final location is TBD in my contract, but obviously at the time of booking, you're deciding your package price upon the area that you will be scouting for the locations in, the permitting that is involved in that area, and then also your time and travel to get to said area. So how does that all work with adventure elopement photography? Because, it's not like you book the venue and then you book the photographer like in a traditional wedding sense.
So I think I've made it easier for myself than a lot of people in that I don't want to be traveling for elopements. I have a 9-month-old daughter at home, so I want to be close to home. I want to be sleeping in my own bed at night. And so I only book things that are within a 2 to 3 hour drive from home. And so I have that 3-hour drive from home set as my maximum for locations in the guide. And then with a note that, if they hate all the locations I provide that are close to home and they decide they want to go down to something like Telluride or Crested Butte, which, Telluride is like a 7-hour drive from my house. So it's not something I want to be doing for every couple because it adds on a full day in each direction. They have to pay extra for that. And so I also do have travel fees outlined in my contract so that they know from the bat, if they don't like the locations I provide within the first radius, they can add on more in order to get a different location. But there is an extra fee associated with that. I think, if you're someone who wants to be traveling to multiple different states and you have someone book you and they don't even know if they want to elope in Washington or Montana or Hawaii or Arizona, you probably have better answers than I will on how to handle that in a contract because I personally have no interest in working outside of Colorado.
Yeah, it's basically the same answer that you just gave in terms of you need to have some type of radius and circumference of where you're willing to go. Because your travel fees to Hawaii are going to be much different than your travel fees to Montana. So I would definitely say have a state and then a region in that state picked out. And then you can have your final location TBD. And then, as Nina said, just make sure that you have additional fees beyond the scope of the package that was, put together for the couple with, the beginning what you guys agreed upon and mutually decided would be the location at the beginning of contracting. And then, of course, the contract would need to be amended if you did decide to go to a different location. So it would be a simple contract amendment, legally speaking, but you want to outline that in additional clauses so that it doesn't come as a surprise to your clients if they just decide to move it, especially Nina, like you said, Hawaii and Montana are so different. One, because Montana doesn't have a lot of the restrictions, COVID restrictions that Hawaii does. And I've seen a lot of people change elopement photography that they had planned just between the two of them and the photographer in Hawaii. And then they can't get to Hawaii or, there's vaccine restrictions or negative test restrictions. And so they have to move things around to a state that's a little bit easier in the US. So I've seen that as well. So location is really good. You want, you guys, location limitation clauses, travel fee clauses, and then scouting clauses is kind of all of the things that Nina and I just talked about. Those are 3 separate clauses that I would make sure you have listed in your contract. They're in our Adventure Elopement Photography contract, but they're very specific to specific purposes. And you don't want to combine all of that into one clause and make it kind of confusing for your clients. I like to have them listed separately. So I just wanted you guys, if you're doing a little checklist here on the clauses you need to make sure you have in your Adventure Elopement Photography contract, those are 3 that we just talked about. Now, Nina, this was a big one that has come up. Really, apropos to what we were talking about at the beginning of this episode, is group size.
Yes.
This clause is one we just added to the contract because we didn't realize it was going to be such a big issue back in 2020, and now it is. So can you kind of explain why this needs to be in your contract?
Yeah. So I had a not so fun situation in 2020 with a couple who, booked me for their elopement. And from the first consult call, they were asking me how many people can we have? Because they wanted a specific location that they had seen on my website before. And I told them that, both because of local group size restrictions and because of the actual geography of the location, it was basically on the edge of a cliff, right? There was a limit to how much space we had available. And I told them we have a very hard max of 10 people at this location. And they're like, okay, that's fine. We'll just have our parents and siblings come. So we'll be 9 people total. And we worked with that assumption throughout the planning. And I show up on their wedding day and there were 30 people there. And at that point, you get that sinking feeling in your stomach where I'm like, oh shit, like this is not okay. But I also can't just get back into my car and leave because they're about to get married and, they paid me to be here and photograph it.
Yeah.
So I did end up shooting it. And, had to bite my tongue to not make some comment about like, what the heck are you guys doing? Like, this is not what we agreed upon. Like, you straight up lied to me about how many people would be here. And I'm the one who's risking getting in trouble for this because, like, I'm on the hook for this as the business who facilitated this elopement.
Right.
This is not okay. And so, I got through the elopement with a smile on my face because that's what you do. But I came home and immediately talked to my local attorney on adding a group size clause to my contract because I did not want to be in that situation again. And I also wanted to make sure that if anyone ever did that again, I had something to point to that says I'm allowed to leave. Like, I don't have to photograph this if you have been lying to me and you are breaking the rules. So yeah, I think that's a very important one for people to have because, luckily this was not in Rocky Mountain National Park or another place that has that strict follow-up on things. But if it had been, and the couple had posted a photo on social media tagging the location and tagging me as the photographer, that is enough for me to lose my photo permit up there and not be allowed to shoot more weddings in the park. And that would have meant that I would have had to move a lot of other, elopements to different places and just taken a big hit to my business. And I don't think that couples always realize that we take it that seriously because they're like, well, who's going to know? And I'm like, people are literally stalking social media location tags to see if people have been breaking the rules. Like, even if the agency itself doesn't see it, another photographer could report you for it because, I think people can be petty like that. And yeah, so trying to make sure that people understand that this is serious and that they have to give us accurate numbers so that we can give them accurate information about the locations they're allowed to do this in.
Yeah, literally so many things come to mind now. So first and foremost, people do stock tags and people are just trolling vloggers for one. Because that was a huge issue with the YouTubers that got caught for filming in a national park without a permit is someone turned them in. And then same thing with photographers is, there's obviously conversations in the industry happening about geotagging and if that's appropriate and the places to do it. And are we going to, have more impact on the land if we continue to promote those locations to clients, things along those lines. But as well as your clients just don't know. They just don't fully grasp and understand the photography world the way we do. And marketing and advertising the way we do, they see it from a consumer standpoint. If you're listening to this episode and thinking to yourself, gosh, I really need to cover my adventure photography business with all the things that Nina and Paige have talked about here, well, don't worry, my friend, I've got you. The Legal Page has tons of resources for adventure photographers, including our exclusive Adventure Elopement Photography contract. It has been reviewed by industry experts to best protect you and your business. This contract has rock-solid clauses, including a huge assumption of risk clause, inclement weather clauses, safe working environment clause, limitation of liability clause, travel fee clauses, cancellation and rescheduling policies, third-party vendor liability clause, and much more. It's by far the most in-depth and comprehensive contract we have in our shop with over 40 clauses. Now, the Legal Page not only has this contract, but we also have adventure session photography contracts and adventure-styled shoot contracts. To learn more about all of these contracts, you can head over to thelegalpage.com/adventure elopement. Again, that's thelegalpage.com/adventure elopement. Now let's get back to the episode. So when you are putting your business on the line, and you're writing your business name down on these permits, you're the one working through all of the holes and loops and, trying to figure out what permit is applicable to this location and the maximum group size in accordance with that permit. You don't want to be the one that gets your, permitting abilities revoked is exactly what Nina's saying. And it's not like she assumed the clients were going to turn her in because they're not going to do, they wouldn't do anything. And they just want their wedding photographed. But they probably didn't fully understand, I mean, I'm sure they did, and they were just going above and beyond what you had said, but they just don't understand the repercussions the way we do. And so not only is a maximum group size clause absolutely essential in these elopement contracts now, we have added it due to this specific issue, and other photographers like Nina that have experienced these kinds of things, where if you don't have this clause, like, you really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like, what are you supposed to do when you show up? Because you don't want bad mouth, like bad referrals happening and them not getting any photos and everybody's there. But at the end of the day, like, you want a clause to point to fall back on, that you can be like, this is not appropriate and you need to cut this down to 10 people in order for me to photograph. And like, we can go to a different location in an hour and meet these people there. Like, there's tons of alternatives here to serve your clients well, but also to uphold your contract and the language in your contract. So make sure you have a maximum group size clause. Nina, is there anything in particular that you would suggest people put in this clause? I know what ours has, but if there's anything that you like told your attorney, I absolutely need to make sure this language is in there.
Mostly what I am allowed to do if they break the rule. So the fact that if they show up with more people than what they have told me in advance, and that is against the rules of the location, I will leave and they will not get a refund and they will not get photos. I think the more clear you can make that, the more seriously people will take it, because no one wants to show up and find out that they paid a lot of money for a wedding photographer who's going to walk away and not give them a single photo. And so I think that's probably the most important part, in addition to, do you set a specific number of how many people you are willing to shoot? Because that depends a little bit on, your individual business and what you want to be doing. So like my friend who doesn't want to have ever more than 5 people in an elopement, she has that in her clause. I don't have that number set because, I do sometimes do elopements where it's 30, 40 people, but they've booked a venue because I told them they needed to. And so the number can vary based on what you want that to be, but you have to have some sort of, consequences for what happens if they break the rule.
Perfect. Yep. So you guys make sure you have all of that in like a maximum group size clause in your contract. In tandem with that comes respecting the environment. The more people you have, the more likely the environment can get damaged. Leave no trace principles aren't going to be upheld. There's a lot of things that come with more people in national parks. So can you explain what type of clause that you have in your contract? We often call this kind of a leave no trace clause, and how they can respect the environment. And then obviously this is in your contract, but what would you suggest for elopement photographers in terms of ensuring that you explain this throughout the planning process prior to their elopement day, so they're really well informed by the day of, their ceremony?
Yeah. So, I think it starts with, education from website on, so that people have read about this before they even contact you. And so I think a good way to talk about that is just, leave no trace principles in general, which I know the elopement photography industry is really good about, highlighting, but also what type of places you can have bigger groups versus what type of places you can't. Durable surfaces being the key word there, as a leave no trace principle too, of you can't walk 30 people out into a field of wildflowers and not leave an impact on the land. It's just impossible. But you also can't have 30 people standing on a trail to do a ceremony, because you're blocking the trail for everyone else. And that also has an impact, And so the way I've personally done that is trying to explain to people that really, if you're having more than like 15 people, you have got to book a place that is equipped to handle groups of bigger sizes. So I'm lucky that, I live close to Rocky Mountain National Park, where they have a couple of ceremony sites that can have up to 30 people. And if someone wants to have more than that 30 people, you've got to straight up book a ceremony venue. You have to book some sort of private land that allows the type of event you want to have, so that you're not having this negative impact on public lands. Because it's super frustrating, because out here, there's a couple of different national forests that have a very we don't really care attitude about permits. And so they've, told couples and photographers that, well, you can technically have up to 75 people outside for an elopement without a permit, as long as you stay on durable surfaces. but there is no way in any of these places to have 75 people without trampling off trail.
Right.
And so it's such an oxymoron where like, I think a lot of us would prefer for them to just set a much smaller guest cap so that we wouldn't be stuck in the situation of like, I had one bride who really wanted 30 people up at this alpine lake. And there's a very narrow beach shore up there that can fit 10 to 15 people, but it cannot fit 30. You know, like you would have to be stepping off into the grass in the tundra. And she emailed the National Forest Office and they're like, oh, you can have up to 75 people on durable surfaces. And she's like, see? And I'm like, that's not what that means. So yeah, I think that level of education of like why this matters.
Yeah.
And then one of the other ways I do this is I have a like automated email that I send to couples after they've picked their location that just talks about every leave no trace principle, which, you know, there's email templates that people can buy. I know Maddie sells them. I know the Foxes sell them. And so having some sort of education like that too, that in depth talks only about leave no trace in that email. So it's not just buried in a really big guide to everything else about the elopement, I think helps people understand like why it matters. And then I also have a separate email that goes all into everything related to having guests at your elopement. So it's obviously only sent to people who are having guests, but it talks about, you know, everything from making sure your mom doesn't show up in high heels to a trail, to also like information the couple should be communicating to their guests in order to make sure they also take it seriously. So like telling your guests that you cannot bring confetti, please don't surprise throw that at us at the end of the ceremony, you know, like things like that. Because that can often be things that the couple doesn't even know about until it's suddenly happening. And there's no way to just like yell out stop in the middle of a confetti toss, you know? So again, like the more education you can give to people in advance, the easier it is to then hold them to something where if you get to a ceremony and you have, you know, the mother-in-law or someone is asking of like, oh, we're doing the confetti toss after, you can be like, actually, no, you're not. And here's why. And I'm sorry, but you can do that back at the house later, you know?
Yeah. I mean, especially with clauses like this, that it makes sense to put in your contract, yes, like a leave no trace clause, and they sign at the bottom dotted line that they agreed to it. The name of the game here is over-educating people. Over-deliver times 10 on these really important clauses we're talking about after they sign the contract. So you're telling them, like Nina said, on your website prior to them even booking you. And then they book you and it's in the contract. And then you're sending it in like 5 separate guides to them prior to the elopement day. So you're trying to mitigate all issues that could come up day of in advance. And I think people sometimes just think a contract's always just like that's it.
Well, no one reads a contract, as frustrating as that is. Like, you know,
no one reads it.
People are just excited to book and they scroll to the bottom and they sign and say that, sure, this is fine. But yeah, I mean, other places where people can put that type of education too is in location guides when you're sharing with the couple. And even before that, in the questionnaire I have my couples fill out before I can make them a location guide, you know, I have a question on, like, do you actually want ceremony decor? Like, is that something that's important to you? Because if you know you want to have like this epic floral arch behind you at your ceremony, tell me now so I can suggest locations that actually allow this. And, you know, most of the time people are like, no, we don't care. We just want nature to be the backdrop. But at least by asking the question, I make them think about it. And if they said no on that, and I suggested locations that don't allow decor, and suddenly on the wedding day, they show up with an arch, I can again point back to, look, we already talked about this. You can't do this because. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the more stuff I run into, like every time, it's just like, okay, where did I miss an opportunity in the planning process before the wedding day? And how can I make sure I don't in the future?
Yeah, I think adventure elopement photographers in particular are constantly having to go back to their contracts and change language in their contracts, and also change kind of their communication with your clients from the time of booking to the elopement day a lot more than traditional wedding photographers are. So that's something to keep in mind too if you decide to go into this niche or you're in this niche. I don't want you to be at a standstill with the process that you currently have or the contract that you currently have. It's absolutely adaptable. And I like to think of them as living documents that you can change according to things that happen. So like this is a really good time at the beginning of the year to do a little DIY audit on your business and be like, what happened last year with clients? Was there any like, whoa moments or situations that you want to, press the little pause button on and see if you can figure out how to communicate that better to your future clients this year so that that issue doesn't occur? Or was there something that wasn't clearly stated in my contract that kept coming up in emails and they just weren't really getting it? Like it took me 3 times to communicate this to a client in an email. That could be something that you go back and look into as well. Maybe you need to bold that language. Maybe you need to point to it prior to them signing. Maybe you need to, highlight that in just a single pager guide versus having it on page 15 of a guide, right? Things that people are going to scroll through. Now, weather, Nina, this is a very situational thing, especially for elopement photographers. And I would say people who shoot adventure sessions as well, because I'm sure you see this all the time. Like people vacation in Colorado and want to do adventure sessions. There's like family, adventurous photographers out there. Same here in Montana. Like people are on vacation and you can never predict the weather. And it's so, so different than regular traditional photography where that's what I used to shoot, and reschedules just would happen because it's fine. We can push it 2 weeks down the road. We can push it 3 weeks down the road, but that is not the case with adventure elopement photography. It gets very complicated very fast. So an inclement weather clause in your contract is probably vastly different than other photographers have. Can you kind of explain the nuances of your weather clause?
Yeah, I mean, it basically says that we are going to shoot rain or shine, and the only way we are postponing or rescheduling is if the weather poses a actual danger to us. So I have shot 185 weddings and elopements now, and I've had to reschedule 2 of those. One of them was the day after Labor Day in 2020, so September 7th or 8th or something like that. And the day before, the forecast update, 2 days before, the forecast was showing a 12-inch snowstorm on September 8th in Colorado, which is pretty crazy even by Colorado standards. And so, I had a quick call with a couple and we're like, okay, I know we were supposed to do Tuesday, move it up a day. Let's do Labor Day, even if it's going to be a little busier on the trails. Let's get this done before the snowstorm comes in. And that just made sense because we were doing a 5-mile hike in the backcountry. We weren't even going to be able to drive up to the trailhead on that day with the snow that was coming in because everything would shut down. And so in that type of, situation, it does make sense to be flexible. I also now only book 1 elopement a week because I really want to have that room to move things if absolutely necessary. When I look back to when I was first starting out and I was shooting very high quantities of elopements and I would have, Thursday, Friday, Saturday booked, I wouldn't have room to move someone even if we needed to. And so I think giving yourself a little breathing room and not shooting 2 or 3 days in a row is really important for that. But then I also do have in that clause that, we're going to move locations before we move dates. So say that it's supposed to rain all day in the place you're going to. Well, can we drive higher up in altitude and have it snow instead? Or if it's going to snow in a location, can we drive down to lower altitude where the weather might be nicer? And so making sure that couples understand through the whole planning process and when they're picking locations and everything that this is plan A, but you have to be okay with plan B or C if we need to change that too. So actually just a couple of weeks ago, I had one elopement that was supposed to be in Rocky Mountain National Park on a Thursday. And as I drive up there that morning, because I was supposed to be there really early, I keep checking Twitter to see updates from the National Park Service because that's where they post it. And the park was closed. And so I call up the couple. It was 9 degrees and windy and blizzard up there. And we're like, well, the park is closed. We can't get to where we're going. The weather is miserable. Do you want to still go for it in a different location, or do you want to push it back until tomorrow when the weather's supposed to be mid-30s and sunny instead? And hopefully the park will have opened. And, they decided to postpone. And then, of course, the next day, the park still wasn't open because snowdrift and stuff. But at least then we were able to go to a different location and have better weather. So it's really a last resort type of thing. But what I'm trying to avoid with having that clause in there is I do not want to have couples email me a week in advance saying, hey, the forecast looks bad on our wedding day. Can we push it back? I'm like, absolutely not. It's going to change so many times over before that. And I think it's pretty obvious from my website and portfolio that I shoot in any type of weather. Like there's enough blizzard photos on there that you please don't ask me to reschedule because it's going to be snowing.
Yeah, that's the kicker here is you want that sentence, that language in that clause that says you will shoot in any and all conditions that are safe to shoot in. So like cloudy weather, or they're going to get an inversion in their photos, at a higher altitude, or there's going to be wind blowing. That's just that's a matter of fact going to happen if you're outdoors. Things along those lines. They can't expect the perfect day. We all want it as adventurous photographers. Sometimes we get really cool weather.
Oh, it's fun.
It's so fun. Like, what kind of art can you create in like a weirdly inclement situation? I think that's always fun to see what photographers do. But for the benefit of your clients, like informing them of that beforehand, having them sign on to that. And then sole discretion is really important, you guys, that kind of language that Nina was talking about. Like have the photographer make the final decision because you're going to know of options and alternatives way before your clients will. And don't let them suggest things. You need to take control of that situation and be the one solely deciding where you're going to go. And of course, in that clause too, Nina, I know we have in our template contract things that are dangerous. Like if there is avalanche warnings, if there is black ice warnings, things along those lines where if you can't get there safely, we're not going to force anyone to get there at all. And we're not going to risk our lives to do so. So an inclement weather clause. Now, with what you just said, like hiking, we still might go into blizzard, right? We might hike to a location. Well, that adds significant risk to what you had planned previously. And the biggest clause that if you do not have it in your contract, I don't know what you're doing as an adventure elopement photographer, but you need, or just an adventurous family photographer for that matter, make sure you have an assumption of risk clause. There are such strenuous, risky activities involved. And even if you are doing an elopement or a session for someone, like Nina said, that maybe isn't as intense, like it's not hiking miles in, backpacking, like you're going up a high grade of, you're increasing it 2,000 to 4,000 feet. Like maybe it's just really, really simple, like you're hiking a half a mile in or something. There are still risks associated with that. That is very different than being at a venue and like driving or walking on pavement. It's so different. So make sure you have a big, bulky clause that should have bold language in it. Like this is the thing you're looking for, an assumption of risk clause. And it essentially says in a lot of words that here are the risks that are known to me that deal with your elopement, including but not limited to language, right? Because you're not going to think of all of them. You agree to voluntarily accept these activities as risky, and you will assume responsibility for all damages or injuries or anything that could happen involving those risks. And then making sure that they, of course, have proper insurance, medical things that would occur. They're ready day of. Of course, you're going to be as prepared as possible with all of that as the elopement photographer, but you want to be held harmless for any injuries that could occur during the session or the elopement. So anything else you'd like to say, Nina, about assumption of risk clauses?
No, I think you covered it. Mostly just how damn important it is to have that in there because there's so much that can happen in the backcountry, even if you're not doing anything dangerous. I mean, literally just spraining your ankle on a normal hiking trail and having to be call search and rescue to get you helicoptered out because you can't walk down on your own accord and your partner can't carry you, that can happen so easily, especially when you're hiking in a wedding dress and you're focused on everything other than where you're putting your feet. So making sure you're not gonna have a couple come back and sue you for hospital expenses or ambulance or helicopter coverage or any of those things.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of people ask me, do they need to be pointed to this clause or initial this clause or anything along those lines? So legally speaking, you guys, just signing at the bottom dotted line is sufficient for them agreeing to the terms and conditions of all of the language in the contract. This, though, is one of those clauses that I would definitely suggest, if you are like, I want to make sure my clients actually look at this clause, you can do one of two things. I always tell people to change out their template emails of how they're sending contracts to clients. So if you guys don't do it this way, if you take anything from this episode, maybe do this. When you're telling clients like, thank you so much, I'm so glad we jumped on the consultation, I'm excited to move forward with you. Here attached in this link is, the package, my contract, and your invoice. Now, before you sign the contract, I just want you to take a peek at a couple really important clauses. And then boom, 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 you list like 3 to 5 clauses there. And if you number your clauses and you have correct headings, it's really easy to point people to be like, clause 3 is payments. Clause 4 is inclement weather. Clause 7 is a leave no trace clause. Clause 10 is is an assumption of risk clause. And then you explain in your own words, like I would say in a sentence, if possible, maybe 2 sentences, convey what that clause means to you and your clients. So it's not in legalese when they first see it in the contract. It's just like you're sitting down and having the conversation with your clients about what this clause means and why we both need to be agreeing to it together. So that is a really good way where if you're additionally worried about them making sure that they look at that clause, I would put your assumption of risk clause in that template email. Alternatively, you can, of course, always have people initial clauses. Like, why not, right? You might as well just double up evidence that they did indeed see that clause and they did indeed agree to it. So you can absolutely do that. It's just not necessary. And I think lots of people think that needs to be necessary. There are, though, like paragraphs, specific sentences in an assumption of risk clause that have to be conspicuous is the legal term here, which means you need to bold it, or it needs to be underlined, or it needs to be in all caps. So it's more conspicuous, which means it stands out from the rest of the contract so that it does come on, high alert to your clients as they're scrolling through your contract. And that's the sentence that says they voluntarily accept and assume all of the risks involved. So those are all of the big clauses, Nina, that I know you and I had kind of outlined here to talk about. I would just love to finish up this episode with, what are your biggest suggestions for people that are just becoming elopement photographers, say in 2021 and here leading into 2022. I think this is going to continue to explode in 2023 and beyond because the pandemic isn't going anywhere. I think people have really changed in their hearts and their minds what they want their weddings to look like. I think social media has changed that quite a bit too for people. And of course, just the stress involved with larger weddings. People are just opting towards something that's a little bit different and that really just conveys their love for one another. So what would you suggest to people who are like, oh, I want to get into this type of photography, if they're listening in and they're like, I don't do this, but this sounds cool. Or people who are new to the game and you're like, hey, I'm a little bit more seasoned than you. I want to give you some pointers.
I think number one is that people should be charging at least as much as they would for a traditional wedding, if not more. Because if this episode has not driven in how much work is involved with this beyond showing up and taking photos, like that is by far the biggest one. Because I see so many people are, oh, I want to shoot an elopement. I'll shoot it for free. I'll shoot it for the cost of travel. I'm like, you can't keep doing that sustainably. Like if you need to do 1 or 2 or 3 elopements to start building your portfolio, and I booked my first $750 Craigslist elopement too. Like we've all been through that, but you can't sustainably keep doing that because there's so much work involved with this. And I think it's so important for photographers to take this responsibility seriously because couples are counting on you to be the expert. Like when they book a wedding photographer, they count on you to take pretty photos and that's about it. Maybe you're helping them with like the family portrait list and the timeline and some of these suggestions on how to get the best photos, but you're still the photographer. When you are the adventure elopement photographer, you are so much more than that. And you shouldn't take that lightly. Like that's not, this is someone's wedding day. It's really important for you to know what you're talking about, that you do the research involved in permits and locations and weather and time of year and all of these things that go into the planning help you're helping couples with, because you just don't want to have someone point to you as the reason why their elopement didn't turn out how it was supposed to be, you know? And I personally love the planning portion of this so much. It's a big portion of why I do this. I think if I just showed up to take the photos, I would have been bored and quit already, but I love everything else that's involved with that. And, you know, I think people need to take that planning and research off of the internet too. Like, yes, there's so much good stuff you can find online and in Facebook groups and everything, but there is still no replacement for driving around and going to trails yourself and visiting them. Because like, you can find a place online and it looks amazing and you see all of these beautiful, serene landscapes with not a person in them. And then you actually show up at 5 p.m. on a Thursday and you see 200 people standing around taking the same photo. And so all of those little things about just finding places on your own. You know, I see a lot of people ask for like, hey, I'm shooting my first ever elopement in Colorado. Where should I go? Give me ideas. And I see why at that point people get a little gatekeepy, because I know I have that tendency myself where I'm like, why should I give you the locations that I have taken years and years to find on my own by spending countless hours driving around and hiking around and finding these places? So I think I can't say that there are no shortcuts to becoming an elopement photographer, because courses like Maddie's that we mentioned is a great shortcut if you want to learn what you need to do. But you still have to put in the actual work of, you know, you can't just say you're an expert without actually having done the research that leads up to that.
There's so much unknown. And for people that don't enjoy the whole planning and scouting and like really spending hours in your car and spending hours alone to prepare in advance for just one day, and probably like sometimes 30 minutes at that one location, that one day. But you're spending hours and hours and hours in advance. I'm really glad that you gave people the pointer of increasing pricing, because there is this huge disconnect between, you know, the consumer side of things where clients assume elopement means spending less money on it. And then the photographer spending more time on it.
Well, I mean, from the couple side, like, yes, you spend less money because you're not booking a $5,000 to $10,000 venue. You're not booking a planner. You're not paying for catering for 150 people. You're not doing all of these other things. But that means you should be spending more on your photographer than you would if you were just going to a venue, because the photographer is doing all of these other things for you. So yeah, I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the answer. Like, people don't understand that, like, just because they're doing an elopement doesn't mean they should be asking a photographer for only 2 hours of coverage. And they're like, well, why can't you know, another photographer quoted me $850. I literally just saw this in a group. And someone was like, but my pricing is this, but then I do have like at the bottom of my pricing the ability to like add on hours or like a la carte pricing. And then the client took that and ran with it. And the photographer then had to explain like why my package is what it is for elopements, because they're exactly what Nina said. Like, if you haven't learned, it takes a lot of time and effort prior to the elopement day that traditional wedding photographers do not have to worry about. I literally had to worry about maybe, I don't know, 4 to 5 hours of communication back and forth, if that, maybe 2 or 3 prior to a wedding day. And the rest of mine was just wedding day coverage and then post-production and getting that images edited and delivered to my clients and finalizing my services. But for you all, you're taking on, you know, the wedding planning responsibilities that a typical planner would take on in a larger, kind of more traditional style of wedding, but you're doing it in a very different way too. So just make sure that you're pricing appropriately, and then just make sure that you're getting all of the education that you need, but also doing a lot of things on your own to make your adventure elopement photography business as, you know, niche as it can be. There's so many out there. Like Nina said, there are more and more photographers coming into the adventurous elopement world or adventurous session world. And you have to be unique, right? What's your unique selling proposition, and what can you offer to your clients that another photographer that they'll find by, you know, searching and SEO would give them as well? So what's going to have you stand out to them?
Well,
Nina,
and I think
oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just wrap that around to what we first started talking about, where I said that the word adventure is so subjective too? Because I think people think they have to live in a place like Colorado or Montana or the Pacific Northwest in order to be a successful elopement photographer. And I just want to call BS on that, because I know how many couples come to me in Colorado from the Midwest or Texas or any of these other places in order to elope, because they don't understand that they have so many cool locations back home too. And so I think if you're sitting in Chicago listening to this now and wondering like, damn, I don't live in Colorado. We don't have mountains. How can I do this? Take the word adventure out of it and look at your local community and the type of places you can go to around you and become the expert on that, because you're going to have so much less competition for it than if you're trying to break into these giant markets where there's already hundreds of photographers doing the exact same thing. Like, I think that's another place where people have so much room to specialize. And, yes, it's really cool to shoot in the mountains, but you also want to have a sustainable life where you're working closer to home so you can do this enough to make a full-time living off of it. And I think that's somewhere where people can do a lot more in their own local states and areas than just thinking they have to be in the top 3 locations.
Yeah, I've used the phrase throughout my entire life as a photographer: find the niche, fill the niche, kill the niche. And the niche, if it's already filled, you're going to have trouble with that part of my saying. And like Nina said, there could be a niche there that hasn't been found and needs to be filled. And then you can absolutely kill it. It might just look a little bit different in terms of the elopement, intimate wedding, micro wedding world, where it's not like, yeah, Nina and I live in Colorado, where it's not, hiking miles on risky terrain in, hiking 14ers or being in Glacier National Park. Like, that's where we're from. But find something unique to your area, and then how you can serve clients really, really well in your area with all of these same principles and keeping those in mind. Nina, this was lovely. I feel like you and I could talk for hours, clearly. Everyone, thanks for hanging on with us in this episode. We got really passionate, both of us did. But Nina, if people want to reach out to you or they have additional questions, where can they find you? And anyone who's just potentially really interested in getting photos done. Yeah. Sometimes we have other people that listen to our podcast as well and not business owners. Where can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm my website is my baby. Like, that's where I spend all my free time. And so it's larsenphoto.co, LARSEN photo. It's the Norwegian spelling, not the Swedish. But I messed that one up when I picked my business name. No one ever gets it right. But it's also Larsen Photo Co. on Instagram as well. And those tend to be the 2 platforms I'm most on.
Great. And you guys know we will link all of this in the show notes, and I'll make sure that you have easy access to talk to Nina if you have additional questions. Thank you all so much for joining and listening. And Nina, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Legal Paige podcast. See, I told you being legally legit isn't so scary. Be sure to visit thelegalpage.com for all show notes. And it would be super awesome if you could head over to iTunes and leave a review. Last but not least, don't forget to join my free Facebook group for unlimited legal and biz Q&A. Chat soon, Legal Pagers.